and welcome. My name is Gabriele Aroni and I am Assistant Professor at the School of Cultural Technology of Xi'an Jiaotong Liverpool University in Suzhou, China. I'm going to talk about the aesthetics of Chinese games and the role that cultural heritage plays in them in this presentation. Digital games have always been a global phenomenon, but at the same time they always displayed some regional differences, especially visible between Japan and the West, but also within the West and with Europe and North America. The rise of AAA big production Chinese games for consoles and PC is relatively recent, so let's go and see what role cultural heritage plays in their development. Before we delve into games themselves, it's worth talking about the fictional genres of wuxia and xianxia, since they are one, if not the one, main influence on Chinese games, especially role-playing games. Very broadly speaking, wuxia are stories focused on kung fu, whereas xianxia focuses more on magic. Very much like Western fantasy, but based mostly on Taoism rather than The Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons. Modern wuxia became particularly popular in the 1950s with the novels of Jin Yong, pictured here, about warriors traveling the land to right wrongs with the power of their martial arts, and exploded as a genre in mainland China in the 1980s. Of course, the origins are much older, going back to the late 13th, 14th century or even before, but as a modern genre, these are its origins. And while sharing similar literary origins, xianxia refers to the more ancient canon of Jiguai, which literally means a record of anomalies or tales of the strange, which in fact dates back to the 3rd century. In the 1990s, a mix of Chinese xianxia elements with more Western Anglo-Saxon tradition gave birth to the so-called Xuanhuan, the mystical fantasy, roughly translated. This aspect, this genre, albeit not very strictly defined, is of particular interest for video games, as while the visual aspect and the story of Chinese role-playing games is mostly based on traditional Chinese elements, we can find many gameplay aspects that are instead based on Western and Japanese conventions. The longest-running RPG series in China is The Legend of Sword and Fairy, also known as Chinese Paladin and currently called just Sword and Fairy in the West, and which roughly translated from the Chinese would be The Tales of Fairy Sword and Strange Master, Xianjian Qi Xianzhuan. The first game was released in 1995, a typical wuxia story in form of RPG developed in Taipei by Softstar, and it was a major success in Greater China. Chinese Paladin, of course, drew inspiration from popular Japanese RPGs of the time, such as Final Fantasy or Chrono Trigger, pictured here, especially in its turn-based combat. But it also looked at Western examples, for example the Ultima series, which is particularly noticeable in its visual. So this displayed this characteristic mix that will accompany Chinese game development ever since, between East and West. Because by the 1990s, Japan already had its own distinctive game design, being one of the first and major countries to develop digital games, which especially in role-playing games remained rather conservative until very recently. While at the same time Chinese games were just starting, and as such they were looking for their own characteristic style. And because of that, they also looked westward to classic isometric RPGs such as Baldur's Gate or Icewind Dale, pictured here, which run on the famous Infinity engine, as many others did. This inspiration is visible in Prince of Qin, an isometric RPG which is set during the Qin dynasty, which, unlike Western counterparts, which were almost always set in fantasy settings, based, if not on Dungeons and Dragons, on equivalent Lord of the Rings-esque fantasy settings, Prince of Qin was set in a real historical epoch with a certain strive for historical fidelity. Back to the Chinese Paladin series, the sequel to the first game only arrived much later, not just with one, but with two games, Sword and Fairy 2 and 3, released in the span of a few months, but especially developed by two different studios, one in Taipei and one in Shanghai. The two games follow different philosophies. Sword and Fairy 2, from the Taipei developer, followed the first one in its look and wuxia themes, so as we can see in the picture here. So look at the hanfu clothing and the 2D pixel style. While the third one, which was developed in Shanghai, sported a new 3D graphics and especially Xianxia story, so more mystical and magical, with a design closer to contemporary Japanese RPGs, more like Tales or Final Fantasy. And it was 3 that was in fact a major success, unlike 2, and because of that influenced the predominant place that Xianxia genre have now in the panorama of Chinese games compared to wuxia. More recently, the RPG that most influenced the world medium has been arguably The Witcher 3, released in 2015, which is particularly relevant to our analysis of Chinese games for two main reasons. First, The Witcher 3 was developed in Poland and was based on Polish folklore, which makes it the first very large international success in the RPG panorama, which is not based on the traditional Anglo-Saxon fantasy or a Japanese role-playing game. And for a more gameplay and style standpoint, it fundamentally established what is the standard for RPGs since it's released a few years ago. Indeed, we can see the influence of The Witcher even on important Japanese role-playing games, such as Final Fantasy, which in its 15th installment borrowed a few elements such as real-time combat and open-world design from a more Western approach, while at the same time maintaining a very distinct Japanese look. So how does it involve all these Chinese games? Well, back to China, Aurogon, which is fundamentally the Shanghai branch of Softstar, released GuJian 3 in 2018, a Xianxia game which had a resounding success in China, as it was hailed as the first real competition to large Western and Japanese production, but based this time on Chinese culture, as we can see from the Pingxi style part in the opening, with characters and themes taken from the traditional Beijing opera. As a novelty for this kind of games, an English translation was released a year later, which sold more than 1 million copies. Since then, it originally came out exclusively in Chinese language. While the references to Chinese heritage are multiple, for example, the Yellow Emperor is mentioned many times, the game is set in an undefined dynastic China with not better references to places and time and characters. Gameplay-wise, it takes strong inspiration from Western role-playing games with semi-open world exploration and real-time combat. Visually, GuJian 3 is strongly based on Chinese heritage. It's a technique that is also used within the game to differentiate between the various realms that are present in the story. So, while the Mortal realm is based on traditional Chinese architecture, expressed through traditional Chinese architectural elements, such as round doors, the lions, the red lanterns, and even opera characters in pagodas, as well as picturesque Chinese landscapes, the otherworldly realm often draws inspiration from Western elements to underline its difference from the mortal normal realm. And this realm has a mixture of Final Fantasy Japanese and Art Nouveau Western architecture, which in fact in turn inspired also Japanese games themselves. We can observe a similar approach in Sword and Fairy 7, which was released last year by the Beijing division of Softstar, who are the actual original author of the Chinese Paladin series, where they detach themselves from the wuxia origin of the game to follow the xianxia style, which is so popular today, especially after the success of GuJian 3 back in 2018. Sword and Fairy 7 is more grounded in Chinese heritage despite being a typically fantasy Xuanhuan game, and even in its description on the Game Platform Steam we can read an action RPG based on Chinese art style, and it was available in English right away since its release. There are in fact numerous references to real locations, for example the city of Kaifang and various existing Buddhist sects within the game, without, however, trying to strive for accurate depictions of places or characters or events. We can still find, as much as in GuJian 3, traditional Chinese villages rendered in wonderful graphics with traditional Chinese architecture and equally traditional Chinese landscapes. And similarly, they are appropriate also to the location they represent. This is Lulong town, which exists in real life in the province of Hebei in the north, and as such it displays a northern Chinese architecture. There is not an attempt to recreate the real city in the game, but at least there is a certain accuracy in styles and locations. Similarly to GuJian 3, the Deva Kingdom, the demon heaven in the game, this other world, is depicted as an interesting, curious mixture of different styles. Art Nouveau, Gothic, and even elements of classical Chinese architecture are all mixed to represent its otherworldliness. In conclusion, we can notice how there is a very strong component of traditional Chinese heritage imbued in these big role-playing games production, which is creating an interesting third pole after the decades-long duopoly of the Anglosphere on one side and Japan to the other, which is undeniably welcome in the panorama of digital game and that can only get more interesting in the future. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to answer any question you might have.